Congresswoman Lee, you just came from a detention center on the border, so tell us what you saw.
Thank you, Jake. First of all, it was heart-wrenching. The images that we see on the media really speak volumes to what's taking place, but when you see it in person, it's horrific. First, we went into the intake center, which is a jail.
McAllen, Texas?
This is in McAllen, Texas, and we also went to the detention center down in Brownsville. But in the intake center, we saw this beautiful little boy in a cell by himself crying, a little girl in a cell by herself crying. And I took some notes because they wouldn't allow us to take pictures or cameras in. And they wouldn't allow us to have our phones. And so once he saw us, you know, we waved and he smiled, but he was distraught. And the
How
little
old was
girl,
he about?
He looked about 3 years old. The little girl looked about 3 also, and she had her head covered, and we waved at her and smiled, and she smiled back. And then we saw another cell with maybe 8 to 10 mothers with children, but there was one little girl sitting out in the waiting area who had been separated from her mother, and they were trying to determine some information before they allowed her in. And when she ran back in, when they allowed her in, the mother just held her and the baby they just cried. But after that, we went into the, and let me just say this, these are cement floors. Now, due to the flooding, generally it's 2 hours in the intake center, but they had to spend the night on these cement floors with Mylar blankets. And I asked the guard, and they're doing their job. I mean, they're the guards, right? They said we just don't, why they didn't have cots or pads. Why these kids and these mothers and fathers
sleeping on cement floors.
He said, we just don't have the resources. I said, wait a minute, Defense Department has a lot of resources. You know, I'm sure we could find out of that $700 billion budget enough resources to bring cots in or pads for these children. Yeah. And it was just, it's tragic. I mean, these people are being criminalized. Went into the processing center where there are cages. Certainly, if people think there aren't, there are. We saw these cages. And then we went to the detention center where we talked to maybe 10 or 15 mothers. These are jails. These are prisons. These are people who are being criminalized. And the mothers that we talked to had no idea where their babies were, where their children were. Yeah. And they had no idea what the time frame was before they could go to a court.
So, David, I know President Trump wants to change the subject to people who have been victims of crimes committed by undocumented immigrants, but this is the story this week: is these children taken from their parents.
Yeah, well, look, first of all, we can and we should do better. None of these kids should be sleeping on the floor. We can do better than that. But to address the point that the Congresswoman raises, they're in jail because they're criminals. They broke the law, right?
By crossing the border illegally.
By crossing the border illegally. Sure they did, Nira. They broke the law. They came across the border. They came across the border illegally, and so they broke the law. That's why they're in jail. You come to a facility. You come to one of the ports of entry. You apply for asylum. You do the things right. Okay, that you're not going to break the law. You cross the border illegally. You're going to be put in jail. We could do lots better than we're doing right now for these kids. We should be. It's a tragedy.
We've learned a lot over the last couple of weeks. So one of the reasons why people are crossing not at ports of entry is because the Trump administration is not allowing people in at the ports of entry. It was basically a bait and switch. Go to the port of entry, go there. That's legal for asylum seekers. A lot of these people are asylum seekers.
Meaning that they're coming, trying to use the immigration laws because they're fleeing violence.
Yes, because they're fleeing violence, threats of murder, death, etc. And that's why they're trying to come here. And they said to go to the ports of entry, but no one was being allowed in at the ports of entry. So that's why they went another way. And the truth of this is we've learned a great deal, which is the Trump administration had a policy of ripping children from their parents in order to. No,
Here, I'm not
General Kelly.
It's a zero tolerance policy.
General Kelly literally said to CNN that the part of the strategy was to have deterrence.
So
it's not true.
Just to be clear,
it's not the policy.
I'm sorry, David.
Just to be clear.
Well, he reversed the policy.
The policy is zero tolerance, meaning everyone gets criminalized, everyone gets prosecuted.
They take the children away.
And that results in
the separation. That's the policy. It's zero tolerance policy.
The separation is a result of the zero tolerance policy. We don't need to fight over the semantics of it. That's what it is.
I think we can be tough on the border and not be cruel. And I think sometimes we confuse toughness with cruelty.
Is this policy cruel, what the Trump administration?
I think if you separate kids from their parents, yeah, that's cruelty. I think being tough is, look, putting people through a process, and if they don't pass that process, sorry, you've got to go back, and you can't come in. But we're also confusing refugee policy with the broader immigration. And what worries me, if you start connecting the dots, on one hand, you have very hard rhetoric about immigrants and criminals and drug dealers, and the president wants to cut legal immigration by half. All these signals tell me that this administration doesn't value immigration, doesn't value immigrants, which is surprising because that betrays a knowledge of our history.
And you know, these women who we talk to,
the moms,
they do not know where their children are. They are not even allowed a phone call because they don't even know who to call and what the numbers would be. And if they knew who to call or had a phone number, they're charged to make that phone call. And these are individuals who have fled violence, walked many, many miles for months. They don't have any money to even a phone call and for a phone call. So it's a whole dehumanizing process, and it's a prison that they're holding women in for committing a misdemeanor.
So the secretary is correct. There's lots of underlying causes, right? I talked about this earlier. Organization of American States, the UN. There's a refugee crisis in Central America needs to be dealt with. Terrible, inhumane conditions in El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras that are driving these people out of their countries. That should be addressed. People shouldn't fear for their lives in their home countries. No one's talking about it. No one's banging on the governments there to do better. I'm not quite certain why. Secretary Gutierrez also talks about that this administration doesn't want to do anything for immigrants. DACA, this president gave a legal pathway to citizenship for 2 million undocumented folks here. Pathway to citizenship. No one ever offered that in the Obama administration. Anybody else? I would disagree that they're totally anti-immigrant.
Let's just take a quick break, and then we're going to come right back. My panel is here with me. David Urban, I want to ask you, you're a vocal supporter of the president. Has this ever happened to you? Has anyone ever asked you to leave a restaurant or anything?
Not yet.
Not yet.
May later today. I would just say this. Look, I think it's sad, right? Nir and I disagree. We're completely opposite sides of many, many issues, most issues. We get along fine, right? You can have civil discourse in America, disagree, right? America should be a marketplace of ideas. We want to have a civil discourse and debate, right? And be able to do that. You shouldn't be asked to leave a restaurant because, and look, if you do, let her suffer the fate. If the people don't want to now frequent her restaurant because of her views, that's great.
Stephanie, I want to just read this quote.
I'm sorry that Sarah Huckabee Sanders had a bad day. I'm not worried about Sarah Huckabee Sanders. I'm worried about the African-American kid in school who gets harassed by kids who think they have a license to harass because the president says so. I'm worried about the Hispanic kid, the Hispanic-American citizen who is harassed at school and called a member of MS-13 because the president calls immigrants from Hispanic countries members of MS-13. I'm not worried about Sarah Huckabee Sanders. I'm worried about millions of kids that today are seeing a different America.
I would just say it's hard to have lectures on civility from the Trump administration. I mean, just yesterday.
I wasn't lecturing in here. It wasn't a lecture.
But just to say.
I think she was referring to Sarah Sanders.
Okay.
The president yesterday is attacking, he started his campaign calling Mexicans rapists. He yesterday is attacking Democrats. Sarah Huckabee Sanders' father is tweeting attacks on Nancy Pelosi as just being supported by MS-13 gang members. So I think that's the challenge here, which is really, this week has been a particularly tough week in that the Trump administration has a policy, which most Americans don't think is a policy debate, but is frankly immoral.
So I want to get reaction to that because it's true. Governor Mike Huckabee, former governor of Arkansas, tweeted something in which he called the people who asked his daughter to leave the restaurant bigots. But at the same day, he also tweeted this. It's an image of what appears to be a Latino gang, and it says Nancy Pelosi introduces her campaign committee for the take back of the House.
Yeah, it's disgusting, really, when you look at this mentality and how he tweeted that picture. And also just with regard to Sarah, she used her government account for taking on this private restaurant, a private business. So I personally think she should be referred to the Office of Government Ethics.
You think that's unethical?
But yeah, if you use a government account to attack a private business on personal time, I mean, that's not right.
You disagree?
We got more important things.
Let me go back to the more important things, and I just want to mention a couple of things that are very important about the children in terms of the separation. First of all, the children that we saw had not seen any mental health professionals. We need
there are no
to make
social
sure,
workers in there?
maybe at some point in the system, but during intake and during the processing, there are no social workers. There may be a couple of caregivers. And so the guards are doing their job, but we need to have people who understand and can counsel these children because they have been traumatized like you would not believe. No legal representation at all until after they're way into the system. And so they have no ability to defend themselves. And then thirdly, let me just say, I think this is so serious that I sent a letter to the Secretary General of the United Nations that I requested that he send UN observers down to conduct an investigation because the world really needs to see what's taking place. This is child abuse, and child abuse is a violation of human rights.
I would just say to that, we have now, over the last 2 weeks, have doctors, health professionals talking about the trauma that this has been created. And again, what we should all recognize is that this trauma, this idea of separating out these children, is a unique to this administration policy. Previous administrations have kept families together. This has decided when parents are leaving with children or when they're coming with children to separate them out. And that, the American Psychological Association, a variety of mental health professionals.
These kids have been traumatized. These poor children have been traumatized their entire lives.
The U.S. government should not be traumatizing.
They just made a 2,000-mile journey with coyotes escaping horrific crimes in their home countries.
The United States should not be the same as a
They're being traumatized along the way.
We should not be perpetrating.
I'm not saying that.
The United States should not be perpetrating violence on children.
It's unfair.
What this argument tells me is that immigration will not be solved under this administration because immigration reform is not build a wall and cut legal immigration by half. It is a lot more complicated, a lot more detailed, a lot more complex. The last bill we had that didn't pass was 700 pages.
Right, and I worked on comprehensive.
I just say something. The last two presidents, your former boss George W. Bush and Barack Obama, both were willing to make compromise and embrace immigration reform, and they could not get it through the Congress because of the immigration hardliners in the House Republican Party. Is it not possible that in the way that only Nixon could go to China, that only Trump could actually get those to come along?
Let me just say this, both sides. Both sides. I saw it in 2006.
I'm just talking about the legislative process.
Republicans were tough on the border and they didn't want citizenship. And Democrats, if they didn't get citizenship, they didn't want a bill.
And this president's proposed citizenship.
This
president has proposed fixing DACA, which is not his mess, which was a mess created by President Obama. Right? Unconstitutionally, perhaps.
No, DACA goes back a lot more.
But Mr. Secretary, the DACA problem is one that was created by by President Obama.
He did not create Dreamers. He created the DACA program.
He created DACA, because he couldn't pass.
You do not know the courts would have done that.
They struck down DACA.
We had a bipartisan bill, and there's a procedure called a discharge petition, and we need 218.
Just to explain, the discharge petition forces the bill onto
the floor.
And
we had 216 votes. We needed 2 more Republicans. This was bipartisan. It was an agreement with Democrats and Republicans, and Paul Ryan would not allow the two.
Should they let that bill onto the floor for a vote?
Look, I think the bill that eventually is the right way to go is what we had under President Bush. The big sticking issue was path to citizenship. Right. So Democrats want a path to citizenship. Republicans don't.
Well,
what do you think undocumented immigrants want? You think they're saying, okay, I'll wait 20 years until somebody gets me citizenship?
They want some sort of legal status.
They want to be legal.
Yeah, they want to be legal
So
status.
I think we've got to get away from these extremes.
Okay, it's not like we just started talking about this. Okay, there is this bipartisan bill. Donald Trump on Friday said, don't pass any bills. If you have a problem with the fact that there's no one pushing a bipartisan process, go talk to the Trump administration. He's blowing it up as we speak.
We have to take a break. Thanks one and all for being here. Really, really appreciate it. And thanks for coming back right after your trip to the border. We appreciate that.